Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to EEE. This is our fifth lecture for the fall. Jim Jones, a Burlington, Vermont native, has maintained a lifelong interest in railroading. His love for underdog trains, we'll find out what that is, and communities they served stems from childhood locomotive rides with his father, noted railroad author Robert C. Jones. Jim's grandfather, Cecil O. Jones, began the family tradition in 1916 when he signed on with Canadian Pacific. Jim has authored 2 Colorado Prairie Railroad Chronicles and 7 local titles, assisted his father on several Vermont books, and to prove he doesn't have a one-track mind, co-authored former ESPN and AWA wrestling personality Larry Nelson's Stranglehold, an intriguing behind-the-scenes glimpse into the private world of professional wrestling. Wow. For 13 years, from 1987 to 2000, Jim was a Denver-based major market and national network radio personality. His voice has been heard by millions worldwide, while his rail-themed photos have appeared in many magazines and calendars. Jim is excited to present Vermont's Island Line Revisited, the troubled life and times of the island-hopping Rutland Railway, and its rebirth as a world-class recreational trail. Please let's welcome Jim Jones.
Remember the old 1970s cassette tape commercials? Is it live or is it memory? It wasn't until I got here I noticed I'm wearing the same shirt. Thanks for coming. A beautiful day out there today, so we couldn't have used the weather as an excuse other than that it's just too nice. So what you see here is little Jimmy Jones in the far left. The Vermont Railway had just taken over. Rutland Railroad 3 years before had gone out of business, and a lot of people thought that none of the track would ever reopen, but large parts of it did. And the picture in the middle is little Jimmy in his first professional photography sitting. And my mother said we couldn't get him to smile. We just couldn't make it happen. And my mother said we always thought maybe because it was September of 1961 when we took that picture, and the Island Line had just had its last final fatal strike that closed it forever. Maybe there was just something there. And that little Fisher-Price toy is the same one that's in the picture before. In the little picture. I think overall it has held up better than I have. Vermont's Island Line Revisited will go from Burlington to Rouse's Point and make a quick jump to Montreal. The Rutland Canadian Railroad island hopped north from Burlington to Alberg and then west to the New York shore at Rouse's Point, basically about 41 miles. For Percival W. Clement, president of the Rutland Railroad, this ambitious project, completed in 1901, fulfilled a 5-year dream of connecting Burlington with Montreal and the grain-rich port city of Ogdensburg, New York. And yes, Percival was governor at one time, a senator, and had a lot of stock in the Rutland Railroad. He had connections, and because of that, he helped to convince the New York Central into helping to build this island line as a competitor to the parallel Delaware and Hudson, which ran on the New York side of the lake. So constructing this required more than 500 Italians who labored for $1 a day under Irishmen of a different tongue. There were lots of newspaper accounts of fights that broke out, people that got hurt, and a whole lot of drinking. At the peak of construction, 11 Burkhardt and Bucyrus steam shovels were in use, including an 85-tonner, which was the largest offered. So this was really late for railroad construction. We're talking the late 1890s. At that point, most of the significant lines had already been built in this country. And oddly enough, most of the lines built after 1870 in the United States have been truncated or abandoned, and most of the ones before Civil War are still in existence today. So yes, they built a little haphazardly, and sometimes rail lines weren't built necessarily with the idea of transporting somebody, but basically just to fleece stockholders and other companies, and just business shenanigans. If I build this railroad, they will buy me out. And that did happen more than a few times. I've been working on the railroad. It wasn't all glory. It wasn't all glamour, especially if you were in the trenches. And on June 25th of 1899, for example, one of the newspaper accounts, there was a storm on a Friday afternoon. And a young Frenchman had just come to work on the Rutland Canadian Railroad, which was the construction name of this railroad. And then once it was done and trains started running, it just became part of the Rutland Railroad. But till then, they had names for each of the lines as they were being built. I'm sure that was a legal maneuver that had to be done. So there was a crash of thunder and blinding flash that shattered the tree and left this man dead upon the ground. Though the gang of Italians under shelter nearby were uninjured, according to the report, his remains were taken back to Ontario the following morning. He was only 19 years of age. Then there was Harry Mossey, who stepped on a, quote, 60-penny spike that pierced through the sole of his shoe and went directly through his foot, and the member is in bad condition. And finally, a French-Canadian brakeman on a construction train fell on the track. The rail car passed over him, quote, severing his head from his body. There were others. I think that's enough. So if you're going to hop across a bunch of islands, you probably need to consider bridges and allowing boats to pass through. So when they started throwing up these causeways between Burlington and Rouse's Point, they had to have three. One connected Colchester with South Hero, another Grand Isle with North Hero, and yet a third from North Hero to South Alberg. All the stations along the island line were built of New York Central design and look like this, or very similar to this. But the depot at Burlington was owned by the Central Vermont Railway, which was a competitor, but it also became the Union Station. So for rent, they were happy to let the Rutland Railroad use it, and the customers were happy to not have to go from one station to another. Same story in Alberg, which at that point was hardly even a dot on the map. So a whistle blast awoke Horace Wadsworth from his easy chair as the first revenue passenger train rattled his windows in a swirl of snowflakes on January 7th, 1901. So you're at what was called the Isle Station, which was not on Isle. It was 5 miles from Isle. When you're building a railroad, you don't make this crazy zigzag to Isle and come back when you can make the most straight possible route. As it is, they had enough bridges, they had enough causeways. So Isle Station was really South Alberg, and probably never was the platform more full than on that first day. In general, it was a very quiet station. A quick look at the timetable from Burlington to Sorel, Montreal. This is basically the Rutland Railroad ran into Vermont, into New York, and then used other people's tracks under trackage agreements to get to Montreal. Here you are in Burlington, standing from roughly Battery Park Hill, looking south at the original Union Station. So we're going to head north. We are 37.1 miles from Alberg, and we're going to be counting down as we head north. So this was the first Union depot that lasted until 1916. Eventually, it served not only the Central Vermont Railway, but the Rutland and the Burlington Traction Company, which I also have a book on. It's amazing the amount of rail that went through the streets and along the streets from Burlington to Essex Junction. So here's the station that we all know now, Main Street Landing. If you look very closely On the far right, you will see the original station. It had yet to be torn down, but it was on extreme borrowed time. So here was the interior of the Union Station that still exists. There's a lot of walls that have been built that make it look very different now. But if you look in there, you can still see the newsstand and some of that marble and a few other things. But for the most part, you'd have to really use your imagination to picture it like that. So we've got the Rutland and the Central Vermont Railway sharing expenses for this station. Passengers entered directly into the 30-foot by 75-foot main waiting room. Tracks on the west at the ground floor. There was an enclosed bridge projected west from the building, and from there, staircases led down to the tracks. So all of that is gone. Look at all those rails. As a rail historian, and I have seen so many of our country's rails go away, I mean, you learn to be grateful just to see one set of tracks somewhere. Kind of a neat nighttime time exposed photograph. All right. So now we're going to go on a little journey. I want to make sure we're all in agreement when we go on this journey. First of all, do not attempt to get on or off moving trains. We agreeable to that? Second of all, don't cross the railroad tracks anywhere without looking both ways. Don't stand on or near the tracks at stations. Don't use the railroad tracks or right-of-way as a path to or from any point. Statistics show that 5 times as many people are killed while trespassing as are killed at grade crossings. Don't place valises, suitcases, packages in the aisles of cars for others to fall over. Don't endanger yourself and others by placing in the racks of cars large articles which are liable to fall. Don't put your hand on the jamb of the car door. The door is liable to close at any instant. Don't place arms or hands on the sills, as windows are liable to come down. And lastly, don't stand on the platform of moving cars. Can we all abide by those rules of safety? Don't know about the last one? That's kind of the best view, isn't it? As long as there's a good railing. Then away we go, crossing College Street here. There are several views, one during the steam era when they had a man on duty to flag the crossings. Second of all, during the diesel era when they did not. There's even a sign that says no flagman on duty. Then there's a flagman on duty again over by what used to be the Burlington Central Vermont Railway Freight House. Heading out of town, across the islands and along the shores of Lake Champlain, the popular route for tourists. This is one of my favorite pictures because it has not only the Central Vermont Railway coming in from Essex Junction, but it has a northbound train headed to the islands, and they have the signal bridge overhead. If it's green, you can go. If it's not, you better not. This is below, this is right around where Depot Street is, below what used to be Kolodny's Market. We're in that part of Burlington, heading out of town, along the water. Right behind Lakeview Cemetery, Burlington High School, North Beach, Rock Point. Train started to pour it on there as you were climbing, heading toward Alberg. Now the passengers, fortunately, didn't have to stop here because literally this was the stinkiest place on the Rutland River. It was the Burlington Rendering Company. And when I started putting the book together, I said, it's amazing that nobody took pictures of the rendering plan. Then later I said to myself, but why would they want to? Fortunately, we were able to, over time, come up with some pictures that appear in the book. We are looking north, and there are some oil cars in there. Basically, animal hides, animal remains were processed here. Lowell Fertilizer Company built 2.3 miles north of downtown Burlington in 1902. It was there during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s when North Avenue was growing like crazy. In the 1940s, they planted some trees between North Avenue and the rendering plant to make the area look a little prettier. I think some people thought it might hold back some of the stench. But by 1969, there wasn't much agriculture left in this area anyway. And the neighbors were very happy to trade Letty Ice Arena for what had been a fertilizer company. Letty Park. Stanford Road, all houses now in this area. It's one of the quiet country crossings that existed. Star Farm Beach. Cottages were a gathering spot for families and friends. They did have a seasonal mom and pop store, a year-round farm that was within view of this itsy bitsy teeny weeny railroad passenger shelter. There's a nicer picture of it. Still a nice place to go picnic. Not a good place, though, to play. Driver watched his car basically become victim to a freight train. A Burlington man had a smashing time doing a good deed as the noon freight passed through the city's New North End on Monday, July 29th, 1957. Seth Densmore, a certified public accountant, came to the Star Farm Road crossing on his way home, and he spotted kids playing on the railroad tracks. The next day's Free Press reported that the Good Samaritan, upon hearing the whistle of a freight train bearing down on the crossing, stopped his car on the downgrade before the crossing, got out, and tried to wave the children off the track. With the youngsters out of harm's way, the northbound freight came into view. As Mr. Densmore turned to watch it go, he saw his car slowly roll down the grade across the center of the tracks. It stopped directly in the path of the oncoming freight, spinning and propelling at 25 feet. Densmore said the emergency brake had failed to hold. The brake was still on when the city police investigated the demolished vehicle. Densmore's 1955 sedan was insured. Now we're at the mouth of the river, where Charlie and Christine Auer had their family boathouse. We spent many fun hours with the Auers and others. So here you are. It's what it used to look like at what they called the mouth of the river. Colchester Point, that wasn't a stop for passengers, but this is where the section crew had one of their section houses along the line. Basically, about every 7 miles, you had a section crew of 3 or 4 people. And Colchester was one of those spots. So we're about ready to head on to the first causeway across the islands and a land of summer joys. So South Hero is next, which is 13 miles from Burlington by rail. Try to do it by car. You know, you have to go up by the interstate and go over and go, you know. But it's amazing how direct this Island Line route was. I was in broadcasting for 40 years, and one of the best storytellers I ever knew in the business was George Cameron. Does anyone remember him from WVMT? He also worked for the Rutland Railroad. He was young enough, he was laid off when they started cutting people in 1953, but he could tell the most beautiful stories, and some of them appear in the documentary DVD that we have for sale at the table. It's hard to get that into a book, but I did do some little excerpts from what he'd talk about, and he'd say, all that weight all that noise, all the dirt, the cinders, the dust, and everything else. And two big Mikado locomotives. And you'd see this beautiful thing in front of you called the Champlain Islands. And of course, he was in the cab of the locomotive. You'd go out across those fills, and there was nothing in the world that was a lovelier sight than those islands. First bridge, the South Hero Bridge. It was open seasonally, only when the boats needed to go by. You had two people who worked it. They stayed in the sheds, the shack, an assistant and the head bridge tender. And during navigation season from early May to mid-November, these guys were on duty essentially 24 hours a day. Now, there was a lot of time they had virtually nothing to do. They did a lot of fishing, read a lot of magazines. Family members would come out, walk out to visit them. They had this big T-shaped handle in the bridge's center that rotated reduction gears and a mechanism in the bridge's pylon below. You can see some of that in that kind of fuzzy photo on your left. 3 island line drawbridges designed to carry the heaviest rolling stock from the trunk lines, and those are the big lines. I mean, this was a very heavily built rail line designed to handle almost anything. Welcome to South Hero. Nice aerial photograph. Station Road is on your left, and it comes out to that intersection, which is still there. The brick house is still there, and I often thought if that house could tell stories. Station is long gone. If you've been over in that area, they often use that for the highway department for storing gravel for the road projects. They're looking out toward South Hero Village. The island line didn't go through most of the villages. It went alongside them or at a distance even. South Hero was a little closer than some of the other ones to the actual community center. Twitchell and Champlin Company's canning factory bought sweet corn from farmers. And I thought this was kind of funny. When they put the labels on the cans, they labeled it Maine's finest corn. Truth in advertising. Don't let the truth stand in the way of a good story. So they were shipped to Boston, New York, and other markets as Maine's finest corn, even though they came from the Champlain Islands. They also had beans. They had beaneries at most of the towns along the island line. Up to 10 women sorting, cleaning, bagging, and shipping during the seasonal harvest. Until 1945, they had a beanery at South Hero. They had a creamery in South Hero. And of course, the iodine spring house. Supposedly, if you go there, that water will cure anything. I've been told it tastes like sulfur. So I don't know, that doesn't sound too appealing to me, but for a little while, apparently the iodine spring house was one of those places that if you got off at the South Hero station, maybe that was your destination. We're heading up toward Keeler's Bay now. You're looking east. Aerial from Keeler's Bay. And Keeler Bay. Not too many pictures, and there was no station there. It was a rail crossing. In fact, this is the best picture I could get of a rail crossing there. That is not a WPA project road work, I'm told, but it was taken during that era. The brick house on the left has been a restaurant for years, and the tracks go right across the picture from the far right center right into the center there. Now, you did have some overhead bridges, clearances that had to be taken under consideration. And when I started making documentary DVDs and books, I always thought telltales were cool. So I called my business Telltale Productions. I Googled it and found out there were other Telltale Productions, but they didn't have the little dash between the tell and the tale, and none of them had anything to do with trains. So I said, I think we're safe. And that is a telltale. You've got the signal on the right and a telltale on your left. And basically, if you've got a guy on top of a boxcar, they have these little wires that are coming down. If it brushes against his head, it said, you better duck fast, because that was basically calibrated to be the height of the bridge. So it would let those guys know so that they wouldn't lose their head. Glory days of railroading. So this is Pearl, another place that the trains did not stop. But if you've ever been out on Pearl Street, you've crossed over this site. Now, Grand Isle Station really was a ways from what we would consider the center of Grand Isle. It was about 1.5 miles off from Route 2. You turn left, there is a sign that says still Grand Isle Station, even though the station has been gone for a long time. And we'll talk about that later on, because it still exists, but it was physically moved. So Grand Isle Station is one of the few crossings on this line that was actually done at what they call grade level. Most of the island line was, the tracks were built below an overpass. Grand Isle Station and Martel's Hotel. That was built in 1901 to coincide with the completion of the island line. Fred Martel also was the rural mail carrier, town blacksmith, the farmer, and he ran the hotel. Other than that, he had nothing to do with this day. Grand Isle Station agent Rupert Barney and his successors sold tickets. They manned the telegraph. They had the freight business. They kept the coals glowing in the potbelly stove at the station. They had a creamery there, a country store, livery stable, and of course the depot was a place to catch up on local gossip. George Smith was one of my friends who was among the last of the Grand Isle Station agents. And one of the things about creating documentary films and books is that the sand is always going through the hourglass. And so many of the people over the last 30 years that I've been collecting their stories have passed on, and George is among them. But he had a way of telling stories also. And he mentioned that he was earning $2.09 an hour, and even showed me one of his pay stubs. He said, you know, Jim, he said, and he talked like that. Grand Isle was a hell of a place in the winter. There wasn't much to do when I wasn't working on the railroad. I even had a TV in there till the lightning hit it one time. Grand Isle had a pretty good business in the 50s. They had a creamery. We used to get feed in, and they shipped the milk out every day. Grand Isle was the busiest station in the islands. Creamery. The last creamery. That building was there well after the railroad was gone. A fire in the 1980s took that away. But it hadn't been a creamery for a while. I think it had been a hardware store or storage area. So as we follow along, the arrow now gets us past Grand Isle. We are heading for Abnaki. Island Park contained a beach, picnic grounds, and a party pavilion on 150 acres at Bow Arrow Point. There's one of the other drawbridges, the second one. Some rail fans during the 1940s. I knew 2 out of the 3 of them, John Gardner and Armand Primo. Folks from the islands might remember Armand as the school superintendent for many years. Okay, this boat in front of us is the Ticonderoga. Almost everyone has been and visited the Ticonderoga at one time. How do you think they slipped the Ticonderoga in between there? This was the deepest section for the bridge. So this was where it went because it had the depth, it had the same width as all the other bridges on the island line that swiveled, but it had a deeper channel right there. And people could go through on the boat. Amazing but true. Abnaki Station, that was yet another seasonal station in the islands. Easily accessible by rail as well as automobile. Campers came from Grand Central Station in New York, from North Station in Boston, and spent weeks or more there. The Green Mountain Flyer was one of 2 passenger trains that ran on the island line. You were required as a camper to write home regularly. In June, the summer visitors, among them children headed for Camp Abnaki, rode the Green Mountain Flyer. The other one was the Mount Royal. And anticipating adult interest in the recreational paradise nearby, in 1901, the railroad built a 140-foot longhouse as a trackside party palace. However, this partying did not go over well at the camp. When you have these kids trying to sleep in the tents and all kinds of shenanigans going on well within earshot. So the railroad responded by closing the controversial gathering area. They sold the building to the camp for $1 and numbered all the pieces on the building and moved it to Abnaki. These 1912 campers and others before and after them generally viewed clothing as optional. A nudist colony for young people, perhaps, wasn't its intent. However, a warning system of hanging the Owasso, which was a flag with a bear on it, if you hanged it upside down, it was designed to alert the boys to quickly clothe themselves because women were on the grounds. So here's a picture of the Longhouse as it is now. It's still there. For its 100th birthday in 2001, they did some work on it, and 25 years later, 24 years later, it's still there. And a popular place for the campers to dine and do recreation. North Hero, station agent's wife, Mrs. McNeil. North Hero is nowhere near what you know as North Hero Village. It was about 2.5 miles to the west. And like some of the other places, they had the beanery, they had a creamery there. Station Howie O'Neill was the agent. He was there for nearly 50 years. I knew his son, interviewed him for the documentary, and his grandson has contributed some of these pictures for the book and the slideshow. The train meet near North Hero. Causeways to classrooms. There is no high school in the islands. There never has been a high school in the islands. So where do you go? Well, back in the day, as today, you went to Burlington, South Burlington, Milton maybe St. Albans. But how'd you get there? You took the train. And because it was so far, a lot of the students would work out an arrangement to stay with a host couple for the week. They'd ride down on the train on Sunday night, come back to the islands on Friday afternoon, and during the week, they stayed with a host family. Helots Point is a long finger of North Hero directly west of the carrying place that creates a long, shallow bay. That bridge is still there. You can see it from the highway. In fact, that picture looks almost the same now because the causeway is still there, the bridge is still there, but everything else is gone. Isle of Mont's apple crop floated to market on Lake Champlain Transportation Company steamers before the railroad's arrival. Now, Isle of Mont, again, was not in Isle of Mont. It was actually technically South Alberg. So if you had apples in Isle of Mont, you had to cart them to the railhead about 5 miles away. This is one of the quieter stations in the islands. Milk, apples, asphalt, feed, sand, and stone among the items that were hauled to or from Isle of Mont over the years. See the back end of a train, and we get to that troublesome overpass on Route 2. You ever wonder if you're up in that area near the Four Corners at Alberg, why there's something called a truck detour? What are they detouring from? Well, now you don't have to detour at all because they took this bridge down when they tore out the tracks. But at one time, it was as the vehicles got bigger, cargo got larger. That bridge had a lot of close calls and a few fatalities over the years. During the last few years of the railroad, when they were building the silos up in that area, one man was riding in the truck, had a tarp over himself. He decided he was going to stick his head out of the tarp for a second to see where he was. You can guess the rest of the story. Welcome to Alberg. Wasn't much of a town, at least at first. All you had was the Central Vermont Railway going through from its line from East Alberg over to Rouse's Point. But when the Rutland built up to the islands and started sharing that bridge over to Rouse's Point, it became a Rutland Railroad town. Even in the 50s, look at all that track. You have in front of the diesel locomotive, you have a soon-to-be knocked down coal chute. Basically, the trains of cars went up coal trestle, and it was quite a setup. All those tracks in Alberg. It's over across from the fire station. Fire station is where the station was. In a book, this fits well. In a slideshow, this does not. So I won't read you all of that. But basically, it talked about the Rutland Railroad timeline. The Central Vermont Railroad gets there in 1851. Ogdensburg and Lake Champlain also arrives at that point, but it didn't last long because the Central Vermont Railway took that line over. And then the Island Line arrived in 1901. So this was one of 3 roundhouses that was there at one time or another. It was a division point. So you had trains going to Montreal, you had trains going over to Ogdensburg, New York, you had trains going south to Burlington, New York City. So you're going to see several different large structures through the islands. And this is where the coal was stored for the entire Rutland Railroad system. The coal would come in on what they called foreign cars. So if it came from Pennsylvania, the coal, it might have come in on Pennsylvania Railroad cars. Well, the Rutland had to pay per diem charges for every day that that car was out of service for the Pennsylvania Railroad. So they devised an idea of let's get all the cars into Alberg, we'll build this trestle, we'll dump them and send the cars right back. And it worked wonders for years. In the book, I interviewed a gentleman who had manned that coaling tower. He talked about it being a very dusty and dirty job. And you had to be really careful when you got that car near the top so you wouldn't go over the other side. So this is the third and final roundhouse. A 150,000 gallon water tank was built in 1924 in Alberg when the railroad stopped using it for fueling, for adding water to the steam locomotives. The town of Alberg bought it. You would think, well, that water must have been really pretty disgusting. It wasn't. It was far more pure than the water source the townies had been drinking from. So they bought the tower from the Rutland Railroad gladly and bought the pump house, hired away the man who had been the pump operator for the Rutland Railroad and gave him a job as the town pump guy. And that building is still there on Lake Street. It is the only surviving Rutland Railroad building in that entire town. So there was a milk plant that was built in Alberg in 1934, part of the Milton Creamery Corporation. Even in 1945, people were still sometimes using horses and 10-gallon milk cans. This is the crossing of US 2. Somebody's in trouble. The original Alberg Union Station was a modest single-story building that went back to when only the Central Vermont went through town. They made it a little nicer. Then they had a fire. They made a second-story, two-story building after that. There was yet another fire. This was the third and final station and custom house. And in later years, it was also the department store. It was the library. "24-hour-a-day agency shifts were divided into what they called tricks. And the first trick was 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. That was held by the Central Vermont Railway agent who was in charge of the entire operation. But because this was a union station, the second trick was manned by a Central Vermont person, while the third, the night trick, from 11 to 7 a.m., was manned by a Rutland Railroad employee. And Steve Mumley, to whom the book was dedicated to, said, "People used to wonder how Mr. Chevalier, who had the nighttime job from 11 to 7 at the train station, could be so spry in the morning time, working on his garden. You would think he would be home sleeping." And then Steve, in his typical dry Vermont humor, said, "I have a feeling the cot in the station had something to do with it." John Morris, Willard W.J. Morris, was the first trick operator. He did not sleep on the job. Look at all he had to do between 7 and 3. You might see 20 trains a day through Alberg at one time. And most of them were during the day or evening time. And because this was a division point, they had a boarding house that was open 24 hours a day. It was called a YMCA boarding house, but it wasn't really directly connected with what we know as the YMCA. But it was a place where you could spend the night, you could play pool, you could get some food at that circular, semicircular table there. Milk train ushered in an era of prosperity for the Rutland Railroad. They called it the $1 Million Milk, and it probably is what kept things going as long as they did. There was also an ice house and harvesting operation that ultimately was doomed to refrigeration, but as you can see, it was a sprawling facility, and that was just west of the downtown Alberg area. And sometimes they'd get snowed in. It would be hard to even find the locomotive. Hard to imagine that much snow. I don't think we've seen that much since 1968, have we? The day at the ice house. In the book, I have Billy Chilton's accounts of all of this, but basically he talked about them cutting blocks of ice. And he even remembered the size, 13 inches by 14 inches by 30 inches in a block. And then other people were assigned to chisel it into smaller pieces known as spuds. Other men pipe poled the blocks, sending them down a slide into a specific level of the ice house. A lot of manual labor there. And finally, the blocks would go into the boxcar and head south, wherever they were needed. Generally, it might be a creamery, keep things cool. The Rutland to Noyan was a short little line that connected Alberg with a Canadian route, which took them to Montreal. So we're now at the end of the island line officially. We're at Ogdensburg and Lake Champlain, milepost 0.1, and the Rutland and Noyan line, milepost 0. So that was known as Alberg Junction, just west of the station. We're going into Canada for this little 5.6-mile line that connected to get the trains to Montreal on the Grand Trunk Railroad. That was the station. Some of these pictures were never published before. Pays to have connections. My father wrote 24 railroad history books over the years, Bob Jones, and some of the pictures came from his collection, but others came from a number of other sources. So we were really able to stuff a lot of stuff into that book that had never seen the light of day before, which is kind of nice to put something conveniently on a bookshelf, no password, no internet connection required. So the Windsor Street Station in Montreal was where the passengers ended up on the Rutland, at least until 1917, when they rerouted through Rouse's Point instead. I'd love to get into the technicalities, but I know that I'm on borrowed time here. So here we are, the Long Bridge, 5,290 feet across from Windmill Point in Alberg to Rouse's Point. This was the second bridge, a swivel. The first one was a floating bridge. This was the third one, and this one was the final one as well. In 1908, they put this one in, and it lasted until the last trains of 1962. It was upgraded over the years, and finally it was powered by a Model A motor to get that, so that nobody had to go and turn the crank on that bridge. So the farther road is the previous highway bridge that we know of to get from Alberg side over to New York. And then the parallel railroad bridge, which thanks to the storm of 2011, has just about wiped out almost everything that was left. This is what they called the gauntlet track. You notice how close they are together, but you could never run two trains across that at one time. That's because the Central Vermont Railway owned 4 feet and 8.5 inches of theirs, and then the Rutland had theirs. They're right next to each other. Welcome to Rouse's Point. That was a station that was torn down about 1950. It's very similar to the one in design to what you'll see at Chester Depot that's still there. So Burlington to Montreal via Rouse's Point. Went through Saint Jean. That station is still there. So you're on somebody else's rails to get to Montreal. The last trains to Montreal were in 1953. And the Rutland could only run passenger trains into Canada. There was no freight business. So when the passenger trains went, it was just Vermont and New York as far as the Rutland Railroad was concerned. 60 years from cheers to tears. It was a short-lived main line railroad, one of the shortest in the country. For a lot of reasons. Really, the line that still exists between Essex Junction and St. Albans and Swanton, it was never prone to flooding. It didn't have the problems you would have essentially running through the middle of a lake. So one thing I found interesting when I was doing the research was, I wonder what the Rutland Railroad did with all their frequent washouts. They had to deal with the Central Vermont. You run on our tracks if your line is out of business. Well, the Rutland was using their tracks through St. Albans all the time. but the Central Vermont seldom ever had a reason to use the Island Line to head south. Engine plunges into lake. Spent the winter there. Pulled it out the next spring. So if you hear stories about the lost locomotive, there's proof that they found it. So you've got the $1 million milk train keeping the Rutland Railroad in the black some years. Passenger service was dwindling over the years. It was never a moneymaker anyway. It was basically railroads were obliged to provide passenger service in many ways. By 1938, they had the Save the Rutland Club. People all along the Rutland Railroad were concerned that the railroad was going to go out of business. And when it was no longer getting funded by the New York Central or other railroads that had an interest in keeping them going because they would keep the competition like the Delaware and Hudson at bay, the Rutland Railroad really had to fend for itself. So this is the Alberg station in later years. By then it was also Pearl's department store and a library. One of the last steam locomotives on the Rutland Railroad, acquired in 1946. If that seems awfully late to you, it's because it is. They should have been buying diesels, but there weren't any available. World War II had just ended, and there was such demand for diesel locomotives that the Rutland, if they wanted new power, had to get steam. And for a few years, they ran some of the nicest, newest steam locomotives anywhere. But by 1950, diesels had to debut. At that point, they could get diesels, and they chose American Locomotive Company from Schenectady as their builder. So this is the diesel era in Alberg. See, my father was from the steam era. He was born in 1934. I was from the diesel era, born in 1961. So we both had our conversations about what our favorite locomotives were. And mine is that one down below, which is called an Road Switcher 3. Station depots started closing down 1952. Most of the stations in the islands closed that year. Passenger service ended in 1953. This is what Burlington Union Station looked like after the last passenger trains. You see the tower going down there, the coal tower being blown up essentially, and all that stray coal dust. And look what happened to the roundhouse. Down to 3 stalls. Rutland Railroad had a strike in 1953. They had a strike in 1960. And the final fatal strike was when little Jimmy was 3 months old in September of 1961. There was a lot of question about what are we going to do with this Rutland Railroad. I mean, almost every town of any population on the western end of the state used that railroad, or at least wanted to have it available. And once you tear up the tracks, they're not coming back. So finally, Vermont worked out an arrangement where they became the first state to actually purchase a railroad, and they found a qualified private operator to run it. And they were told essentially that if you make money, you have to give us a percentage of your profits, and you have to pay rent for the railroad. And it turned out that, well, I'm getting ahead of myself again, because I like talking about the Vermont Railway story because it is truly a success, and it all happened right here in Vermont. It became the blueprint for a successful railroad story. So the Alberg Underpass lost its top in 1961, and it didn't get it back until they tore up the tracks a few years later. Central Vermont Railway runs its last train a year after the Rutland was done, 1962. Then we had the deafening sound of silence. As we go down the road, some certified rail nuts took pictures of the island line when it was, look at how quickly weeds can grow on a line that was very well maintained. But if you don't bring the weeder out every year or two, you're going to have quick growth. There's Grand Isle, which was an active station right up until 1961. Pulling up the Island Line, they started in Burlington and worked north. The far right is where the overpass was. And it's in South Hero. For a few years, the Island Line tracks did go north of College Street in Burlington, which is the official beginning of it. But they only went to the rendering plant because the rendering plant wanted service. So for about 5 years, they did make little runs like this up to the rendering plant. They had to push forward. That's why you have the caboose. There was a man on the front with a radio saying, all right, we've got a crossing coming up. And then on the way back, they just went forward. Island Line treasures. This is where we wrap things up. And 405 still exists. One of my favorite Alco locomotives. And it is still out there running on the Rutland Railroad, former Rutland Railroad tracks, as it has since 1951. What became of the Grand Isle Station? All the others had been knocked down, but because this was an active station up until the end of the railroad, it just sat there and rotted for about 14 years. Until John Verba, who was alarmed at the fact that the town of Grand Isle wanted to basically gut out the station and use it as a salt shed, said, I will buy you a salt shed. I want to save that station. And they're like, well, if you want it, you have to move it. So they moved it. And they worked out a plan. It had to be done when the ground was frozen. And they went partially through the down the highway and then across through the state park to some land that John and his wife had. And it's still there. They've added dormers, but the building is still there. Here we are with the local motion portion of the story, where they have turned what was a forgotten, unknown treasure into a recreational paradise. But thanks to Bill Hockey and others who had vision, who purchased the significant ferry that they now use, people can get across there during certain times of the year. And there's a few little sections you can still walk and find little remnants that are not recreational trails. But every year there's less and less to see. This was the bridge house, the bridge tender's house over near Camp Abnaki, which was saved as a camp. It's where the station was, now the fire station. The world's longest inland lake freshwater fishing pier was Rouse's Point till the flood of 2011, when basically everything came down. And that was the end of that story. So thank you for joining us today and taking this tour over the Island Line.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. We have time for maybe one question.
Yeah.
But
Hopefully I answered most of them so you don't have very many.
Are you available after if somebody wants?
Yeah. I do have books for sale for $30 and significantly off the cover price, and the documentary DVD is $10. And I'd be glad to talk with anybody who has questions over there. Table after.
Anybody?
Have I left you speechless?
All right. Well, thanks, Jim. Thanks for
Thank you.
really interesting presentation.